So, welcome to CHI's Masters of Suspicion class at Kafka. For this session, we're looking at week 3, the burden of shame. Last week, in terms of review, we discussed Kay's complicity in being arrested and prosecuted for a crime whose nature would not be disclosed. We focused on his areas of weakness and ways that Kafka illuminates Kay's continued ignorance of his weakness. We also talked about his treatment of women and those that he finds to be inferior, treatment that suggests both scorn and dependence. One additional comment about last week that I'll mention briefly, I had talked about my experience of being observable. And I am observable as a very large, tall, white man with a very large beard and tattoos and whatnot. But in a conversation after class, I was reminded that others experience something far more like Kay than I do. When people look at me, I'm observable, but I'm observable as a white man, which is traditionally somebody who has a lot of power. I look like I have a lot of power. I look like it's just, I'm big. But the way that Kay's observed is more like the experience of being a woman, who's constantly observed and judged by others, threatened, and vulnerable under somebody else's gaze. It's like the experience of black Americans who are often seen and judged as guilty instantly without having done anything wrong. And we're not even talking about something truly wrong, we're just talking about doing something wrong, period. And others, I guess, what I want to say, have a far better sense of what Kafka presents than what I am able to as a white man in America. I can't have those experiences. But you can. Some of you can. And understand really what it's like in a far more powerful way than I can. Does that make sense? I just wanted to clarify that. In a preview, this week we'll focus on how Kay's trial begins to grow in his mind and the effect that it has on his social relations. Given his initial introduction to the courts in his trial, through a case that he told himself he thought of as a vexing and stupid irritant, it seems surprising how much the issue begins to wear Kay down. Our focus for this week will be on the clues Kafka provides as to why this shift occurs. The questions that will direct today's lessons are, 1, what sort of character does Kay have? And 2, what is the character of justice? All right. So I'll start out with the flogger, which is one of my favorite chapters. I mean, it has all the absurdity that I loved in some of the early cartoons, like the Muppet Babies, where they'd open the door and they'd see ninjas working out and they'd close the door. I mean, just random things. I loved that. And again, it goes into the nightmare dream logic too, right? So on page 80, it says, a few evenings later, he heard the sound of groans behind a door that he had always assumed led to a mere junk room, though he had never himself seen it. He was seized by such uncontrollable curiosity that he practically tore the door open. It was, as he had suspected, a junk room. It's a junk room, but what attracts him with insatiable curiosity are the sound of groans. And the sound of somebody groaning renders him so curious that he throws the door open to see what's there. And it's an interesting thing to become that curious. I mean, there's no trepidation behind it. There's no concern. There's no care. There's no worry. It's curiosity, which is an interesting response, I think, to a groan. And I think it's revelatory of something of Kay's character. Page 81. What's going on here? Kay blurted out in his excitement, but not loudly. One man, who is apparently in charge of the others, was got up in some sort of dark leather garment that left his neck and upper chest, as well as his entire arms, bare. He didn't reply. But the other two cried out, "Sir, we're about to be flogged because you complained about us to the examining magistrate." And only then did Kay recognize that it was indeed the guards, Franz and Willem. Right? And so, I mean, he throws open the door, and he sees the, I can't do justice really to the flogger, He sees the flogger, and then he sees the two guards, who he doesn't recognize, right? They're beneath him in a way that they have to call attention to him so that Kay can actually even recognize that he should know who they are. And then the guards explain how poorly they're paid, how it's tradition to eat breakfast, like here's all the reasons kind of behind why we did what we did. It's accepted. And their arguments that they're making are surprisingly not unlike the fact that what they're doing is not truly wrong. The way that what Kay does is not truly wrong, right? It might be wrong, but it wasn't truly wrong because it's acceptable. Everybody knows that this is how it works, right? There's nothing truly wrong with what we did. You had no right to have a grievance against us. It was fine. The flogger explains, you mustn't believe everything that they say, right? So once again, any perspective or any opinion, any thought that ever emerges through the book is continually discounted. You can't trust Kay's opinion of things because you know he's unreliable. Anything that's mentioned about the courts, from the courts, about any other character is equally unreliable. Nobody knows how to tell the truth as it is, except for maybe like Frau Grubach or Fräulein Bursner, right? There's no reason, we're not predisposed to doubting their word about things because they seem to have a sense of inner integrity or authenticity that grounds them. Any of the men that you encounter in the book are taken up by the logic of the court, by the logic of what's truly wrong, and they're far more open to making excuses and justifications along those lines. Does that make sense? Okay. Kay says, I don't even consider them guilty. It's the organization that's guilty. It's the high officials who are guilty. Right? And so again, he buys into that logic. What's punishable aren't those who do things that are truly wrong. It's those who have power. Right? Those who act in ways that are conventionally accepted, they're fine. The ones who are guilty are the ones who want to hold them accountable in some way. Okay? So he's trying to reverse the power structure, lifting this example up as what's appropriate and denying the ability for anybody to pass judgment on it. If you pass judgment in the wrong kind of way, you're guilty. If you do things that are socially acceptable, even if they're not good, you're not guilty. Is this making sense? Okay. Page 85. Here's what Kay tells himself. Quote, it tormented him that he had been unable to prevent the flogging, but it wasn't his fault. Of course. If Franz hadn't screamed, of course it must have hurt terribly, but at critical moments you have to control yourself, unlike what Kay does. If he hadn't screamed, Kay could very probably, right? I mean, it's so conditionalized, but it's close enough. It's enough of a possibility that he can count it as legit, right? He could have very probably still have found some way to convince the flogger. I mean, there's so much obfuscation that's torn up in this justification, but it's enough for him to give himself a pass on that. If the entire lowest level of the bureaucracy was made up of riffraff, why should the flogger, who had the most inhuman job of all, be an exception? Kay wouldn't have been stingy. He really wanted to get the guards off. Having already begun to fight corruption in the judicial system, it was only natural to take this approach as well. Okay, and again, his way of fighting corruption would have been to bribe the flogger. Right? He wants to fight corruption in the justice system by bribing the flogger to release the guards whom the justice system had convicted of being corrupt. Right? I mean, do you see? I mean, it's just all circles. But the moment Franz started screaming, it was all over, of course. Kay couldn't permit the assistants to arrive and catch him negotiating with this bunch in the junk room. Not humans, they're this bunch. No one could really demand such a sacrifice of him. And again, it's that vague, omnipresent sense of no one, right? No one could have demanded. It's this abstracted position, which means in some ways he himself wouldn't demand him of himself, and if he's going to universalize it, no one else would demand it of him either, right? Nobody could expect that sacrifice. But the whole reason why he's thinking through that process is he understands where somebody actually might have demanded that sacrifice, right? His response to that is to say, wait, no one could have demanded that. But it comes up as a question that he answers before he realizes that the question's been asked. Does that make sense? I'm just trying to unravel some of the logic of his thinking. Okay? If he intended one, it would have almost been simpler for Kay to strip and offer himself to the flogger in place of the guards. That would make sense. The flogger would hardly have accepted the substitution, however. Kay could not have done otherwise than slam the door, even though he had by no means escaped all danger by doing so even now. Right? He says, I guess I could have offered myself. The flogger wouldn't have taken it. He would have taken money if I would have had more time, but he wouldn't have taken me. Right? And the whole logic of it denies that what he did was truly wrong. Right? Just sentence by sentence by sentence are these weak, whimsied self-justifications that don't really show integrity. They don't show his ability to take responsibility or to be a responsible citizen or human in the world. Yeah?
Well, doesn't he even, or maybe you're getting to that point, but he takes even less responsibility later, a day or so later, when he tells one of the minions to, go clean up the junk room, because they're still there.
Yeah.
He doesn't say there anybody in there or anything like that.
No, he's just done. The last line from this, or the last sentence from this passage, that he had shoved Franz at the end was unfortunate. Right? Like, he shoves Franz, that was unfortunate, but it could only be excused by a state of agitation. Right? So not only does he not help him, he shoves him, but that's okay because he was agitated. He could not have been expected to do otherwise. Except the very reason that he needs to add that is because he does have that. I mean, it just all circles back to his attempt to avoid the burden of shame. He feels ashamed. He doesn't want to admit that he feels ashamed, and therefore has to do all these convoluted thought loops to tell himself that that burden of shame is unmerited and that it's not his. Does that make sense? I think it's a very human thing to do. I don't think Kay is unrelatable to most of us deep, deep down. Maybe not you people, you seem like good people, but the other readers of this book, perhaps.
We haven't really done anything very wrong.
Right, exactly. All right, so here you go, page 86, the next day. The next day, Kay still couldn't get the guards off his mind. He had difficulty concentrating on his work. As he passed the junk room again, he opened the door as if by habit. What he saw, and again, he's never opened the door. So he opens it as if by habit, but it's not a habit that he's ever had because he's never actually opened the door. That was clarified earlier. What he saw bewildered him completely. Everything was unchanged, just as he had found it the previous evening. The printed forms and ink bottles just beyond the threshold, the flogger with the rod, the guards still completely clothed, the candle on the shelf, and the guards began to wail, crying out, "Sir!" Kay slammed the door shut at once and pounded his fists against it as if to close it more tightly. Right? Time's frozen in there. It starts up as he opens the door, and he slams it, and he can't close it tightly enough. And then, as you say, he tells somebody else to clean up the mess. It's not his responsibility, and he doesn't want to even know that it's there. Is it a nightmare logic? Absolutely, right? It's impossible for it to be that way. But it also makes sense on a level that isn't rational. Because, of course, that's the only way it could possibly be. The situation hasn't been dealt with.
To me, it represents his guilt. It's there, he can't escape it, it's inside, and he keeps coming back to it, but he keeps trying to push it away.
So there are 5 implications out of the flogger that I wanted to point out. Number 1, Kay has shown that his bearing witness against others has implications, even if they're not the ones that he anticipated. Right? The judgments that he passes on others matter. They have consequences. He has power and authority within the court system. He just doesn't want to recognize it as such because that's what he tells himself he's railing against. But he has power, and his words matter within the court system. Number 2, he fears being seen by others more than he fears injustice. Number 3, he's willing to sacrifice money, but not his reputation and not his own flesh. There's a limit to what he's willing to do, but he's not even really willing to do that. He just tells himself, right? He says, I wouldn't sacrifice this much, I would sacrifice that. He didn't even try to sacrifice that. He just holds that out as something he could have possibly maybe done if other things wouldn't have prevented him from doing so. The fact is, we don't know for sure that Kay would have done it, and he probably wouldn't have. Number 4. Kafka's brilliance in having Kay return to the room exactly as it was plays with the dream logic, which we talked about before class, without any indication that it isn't real in the story. Right? Within the story, it's real. It's not a dream. It's dream logic, but it's real relative to the characters in the story. It gets right the fact that for Kay, nobody's left the room. It's still present and real to him exactly as he left it. It never mentions that he goes back to check, But one could assume that if Kay ever goes back into the junk room and opens the door, it will always be there. The flogger and the guards will be there in perpetuity, because nothing will ever release them from that state. Number 5, according to the logic, I mean, rationally it would, right? But according to the logic of the story, given how Kafka set it up, they're just always there. Number 5, justice appears to be corrupt in its execution, but relentless in its application. In other words, although the process may be tangled, its final end is ruthless and without mercy. There's no escape from it. It will find you, and it will hurt you when it does. And however the process is meted out, however the judgments are rendered and how they occur, whatever makes the verdict come to pass doesn't matter. It will hurt you. You will be harmed. You will suffer. And that's justice.
What was number 3 again?
Number 3, he's willing to sacrifice money, but not his own reputation or his own flesh. Those are more important to him than money. And really, probably not the money either. That's just the thing he tells himself he would do.
Could you state 5 again? That was very clear.
Yeah. 5, justice appears to be corrupt in its execution, but relentless in its application. So the process by which the verdict is rendered appears to be hopelessly tangled and obscured and unable to be appealed and all of those things, right? So it seems to be corrupt at least at that level. And it seems to be corrupt in terms of even what the guards are doing and whatever. But the way that it's executed is ruthless. It's merciless. Yeah.
That makes me think of when they sent me to prison. It was, again, very corrupt, very tangled, very weird. But when you felt the burden of it, then it was remorseless and very painful. So that makes sense in terms of a real prison in modern day life.
Yeah. Yeah, I would imagine so. I'd imagine so. Are we ready to move on to the uncle? And Lenny? Okay. So his uncle is his guardian from the country, and he comes to visit because he's worried about the trial. Page 93. But how did it happen, his uncle finally asked, stopping so suddenly that the people walking behind him were startled and had to step to the side. These things don't happen all at once. They build up over a long period of time. There must have been some indications. Why didn't you write to me? Of course I'll still help you, but it's going to be very difficult now that the trial is already underway. Right? His uncle knows about the trial, but what his uncle knows is very different from Kay's experience of it. All Kay sees is that his life has gone along as this fluid and unending, just power trip. You know, things are going pretty well all the time. And suddenly, the court comes down and interrupts it. What his uncle knows about the process is, it's more like what Marley talks about to Scrooge, where you're building chains your whole life that eventually imprison you when you die. Right? These things build up slowly. You should have had some indication. And so from his uncle's perspective, this flat line of just uninterrupted success is actually this huge pile of evidence mounting against him that Kay should have been aware of. Right? Kay was responsible for his actions, but he didn't know to be responsible for them. He refused to take responsibility because with responsibility comes the burden of shame. He would have to feel guilt, and he would have to feel shame, and he would have to be no longer okay with doing nothing that was truly wrong. He would have to do something right. But because he was unwilling to do so, he ignored it all, and his uncle knows, or suspects, I think, that something like that must have happened. Does that make sense?
So the shame is due to inaction?
His shame is due to his inability to authentically question who he is and how he should behave in any given situation. And again, that's kind of an off-the-cuff. Shame gets mentioned and it develops throughout this story. It's an interesting word as well as guilt to pay attention to. But it's a shame about who he is and how he holds himself in the world.
Situational denial.
Yeah. Page 94, his uncle encourages him to go to the country. saying, quote, "Here they have all sorts of instruments of power, and they will necessarily automatically use them against you." Sound familiar? But in the country, they would first have to delegate agents or try to get at you entirely by letter or by telegraph or by telephone. Naturally, that weakens the effect. It doesn't free you, of course, but it gives you some breathing room. Do you want to lose this trial? Do you know what that means? It means you'll simply be crossed off, and all of your relatives will be drawn in. And there's something incredibly unsettling about just the result of the trial is that you will be crossed off. And that's it. That's what the verdict looked like. It's a crossing off of your name. And there's something, I think, very simple and very, very chilling about whatever list you're crossed off of when it happens. So, the fault is Kay's. I mean, given what the uncle says, and assuming that the uncle has some insight into what the trial is, the fault is Kay's for not having realized that the trial was imminent. Right? It's not just that he's guilty, it's that he's guilty of not knowing that he's been guilty. It's not that he was innocent, it's just that he was refusing to accept his proper due of guilt. He wasn't responsible. Once again here, justice is revealed as relentless also, like the instruments of power, the agents coming at you, whatever, right? Justice is relentless, although occasionally it's slow, and Kay is disclosed as being clueless. Pretty much throughout the book. The uncle also mentions the automatic institutions of power which rely, as the Great Wall suggested, on proximity, and he also thinks that things weaken in distance. Right? The more people there are, the more power is able to centralize, and the more powerful that power becomes. Once you move out of urban centers, power weakens, right? Speed limits aren't necessarily as highly enforced on gravel roads. Have you encountered this driving along Iowa Highway, or even the 2-lane highway? Mm-hmm. You know, you're going to get pulled over in University Heights far more often than you will if you're just taking one. Mm-hmm. Every time, right? That's power. That's how it works. He talks to Holt on page 103. This is his uncle's friend who's a lawyer. Kafka writes, Kay could observe everything at his leisure, for no one paid any attention to him. The chief clerk, now that he had been drawn forth, took the lead in the conversation. The lawyer, whose initial weakness may have been intended simply to cut short the new visit, listened attentively. Kay's uncle, the candle-bearer, had soon overcome his embarrassment and was now simply delighted, both by the chief clerk's words and by the gentle, undulating gestures with which he accompanied them. Kay was totally ignored by the chief clerk, perhaps even intentionally, and functioned merely as an auditor for the old men. Okay, so, I mean, the lawyer's sitting there, the chief clerk happens to be visiting, Holt is in his sick bed, his nursemaid tries to keep him out, they go in though, and then lo and behold, the chief clerk's been there this whole time. Very important player in the hierarchy of whatnot. Or maybe not, because you never know how high up anybody is, right? There's a lot of power on the one hand, but on the other hand, the chief clerk's completely ineffectual. But you can't, alienate the chief clerk because that'll destroy the whole process. But being friends with the chief clerk won't necessarily endear you to anybody either. This is the whole nightmare of an inability to know what to do once you're in the system. But Kay is revealed as totally marginal to the process, right? Whatever the process of his trial is, he's irrelevant to it and its workings. Although he's the object of the trial, the process of justice is self-involved and self-concerned. Justice, in fact, becomes a mirror of Kay's character. It's full of busyness. It's full of conversation and talking and power and things not going anywhere and things not doing anything, which seems to resemble a lot of Kay's own character, right? Conversations and meetings and people coming in and people going out and telephone calls and people at the desk and papers to sign and things to do. This justice system is peculiarly busy with people just talking and not talking about the object of what they're talking about. Right? Does that make sense?
But it also never tells people what they're accused of.
No. It's like in the penal colony story, right? You only know what you're accused of when you discover what your guilt is, when it's written on your body, and then you understand. But, I could tell you what you're guilty of, but until you already know what you're guilty of, me telling you doesn't say anything, right? I mean, the uncle basically tells him what he's guilty of, and he doesn't know how to understand it. It's only when he understands that he'll understand what the verdict is. And it seems tautological, but there's a tiny way in which it's not quite a tautology, and it's that tiny way that Kafka's interested in exploring. Does that make sense for now? Mm-hmm. Okay. So, Lenny then breaks the plate to draw Kay out of the room, right? And once again, Kay is alone with a woman who desires him, and they start doing all sorts of things. And while they're sitting there, he's looking at a portrait of a judge, and here's what Kafka says. There's a portrait of him when he was young, but he surely never looked like that. He's so small, he's almost tiny. Even so, he hadn't stretched out that way in the painting since he's so ridiculously vain like everyone here. Kay says, the higher judges stay in hiding, but yet he's sitting on a throne. Lenny replies, that's all an invention. And she bends her head over Kay's hand. He's actually sitting on a kitchen stool with an old horse blanket folded over it. But is your trial all you think about? So again, there's the representations of power that are totally at odds with the reality of power, right? Justice, in this case, is once again disclosed as something hidden. The highest judges remain inaccessible, and those who relate to the public are vain, and they try to disguise themselves. While it's hypocritical, once again, justice seems to reflect Kay's character. When you look at what Kay does, he hides in his office. He refuses to see people. He depicts himself as being otherwise than what he is, all the time, right? Judges aren't judges, it seems, because they're great or wise or especially judicious. They're judges because they judge people. That's what makes them a judge. Lenny's advice, quote, don't be so stubborn. You can't defend yourself against this court. All you can do is confess. Confess the first chance you get. That's the only chance you have to escape, the only one. However, even that is impossible without help from others. I'll help you myself. Right? So he has to confess something, but he doesn't understand what he's guilty of. And it's not because they haven't charged him with it. It's more that the charge isn't something that he's able to understand, and that's why he's guilty. Right? And so if he can't understand what the charge is, and he can't understand what his guilt is, it's going to be really hard for him to confess to it. In some ways, if you're going to take Lenny at her word, that's why he needs to be helped by others to see what he has to confess to. But I don't think that's the kind of help that Lenny's offering. And I don't think that's the kind of help that Kay knows how to accept. Is that a fair statement? Okay. 108, Lenny shows him her defects. She has a weird claw hand, like it's all webbed. She's painted really animalistically by Kafka. And during the exchange, she's asked about his girlfriend if he's seeing somebody, and he says no, because he just has like repeated one-night stands with the woman. It's not a serious relationship. So he says no, yeah, and yes, shows the picture, and then after he kisses her hand, Lenny says, "Oh, you've traded her for me after all." She's very plugged into an economics and a barter system, and that's the way that she navigates through her world. Does that make sense? All right. Next chapter. Are we ready to move on? Page 111. Lawyer, manufacturer, painter. Kafka writes, instead of working, he swung about in his chair, moved a few items slowly around on his desk, and then, without being aware of it, left his arm outstretched on the desktop and remained sitting motionless with bowed head. The thought of his trial never left him now. Kay is becoming increasingly enmeshed in the fact of his trial, which exchanges one form of productive busyness, where he's skilled, right, the productive busyness of his office, for another where he's helpless and at a loss. The trial causes him to do nothing. And this reveals how justice is disempowering. Or at least the character of justice as the trial starts to magnify. Do you see how justice has its own character? In the visions of the law offices, of the law books, of the judges, of the lawyers, of the guards, of the flogger, of all the people related to the courts, what justice is starts to develop a certain kind of character. The nature of that character seems very much to reflect Kay. Do you see that? That's at least part of the argument that I'm trying to make today. Is that making sense? Okay. Page 113, the lawyer's advice. Kafka writes, "The first petition was nearly finished. It was very important, for the first impression made by the defense often influenced the whole course of proceedings. Unfortunately," and he felt he must point this out to Kay, "on some occasions, initial petitions were not even read by the court. They were simply put in the file with a note that for the time being, the hearings and surveillance of the accused were much more important than anything put in writing. Kay must not overlook the fact that if the proceedings are not public, they can be made public. The court records and above all the writ of indictment are not available to the accused or his defense lawyers, so that in general it's not known or not known precisely what the first petition should be directed against, and for that reason it can only be by chance that it contains something of importance to the case." Okay, and once again, it's Kafka logic, right? There's nothing more important than the initial petition, which might not ever be read, and even if it is read, it might be ignored, and then as it's being written, there's no way to know what it should be directed against, and it probably doesn't matter, but it's still the most important thing.
That's pretty brilliant, actually.
Yeah! Yeah. I mean, it's like he's tried to encounter something with the university offices or something. I'm not sure. It's bureaucracy, clearly, right? It's clearly a bureaucratic form of power and a very bureaucratic form of logic that Kafka, for whatever reason, understood how to transport in its most crude and absurd pattern. It becomes an M.C. Escher painting, right? Page 117. Here, the disadvantage of a court system that was grounded from its very beginning on secrecy came to the fore. The officials lacked contact with the common people. They're well prepared for the normal average trial, which rolls along its course almost on its own and needs only a push now and then. But faced with very simple cases, or with particularly complex ones, they're often at a loss, because they're constrained and constantly constricted by the law, both night and day. They have no proper understanding of human relationships, and in such cases they feel that lack keenly. Here, in this passage, both Justice and Kay are framed as confused. It's impossible to find a perspective from which one can see things clearly. Justice can't because it doesn't have any humanity to it. Kay can't because he has no justice in his life, right? I mean, they're mutually at odds. Also, both Kay and the law have issues with secrecy and the understandings of human relationships, right? I mean, Kay doesn't have any understanding of human relationships either, really. And when you look at how he treats people or how he interacts, he's not really friendly. He doesn't even have friends. Right? He doesn't have a good understanding of how to behave with others. His inability to relate with others has been well documented, as has the laws. Right? Both of them have issues in this regard. There's that. Page 135. The manufacturer describes Tittarelli. He says, quote, "Of course Tittarelli gossips a lot, and I often have to turn him off, not simply because he surely lies as well, but above all, because a businessman like myself, almost collapsing beneath the burdens of his own affairs, can't spend too much time worrying about those of others." And once again, like it's just, here's information, it comes from a bad source, you can't trust it, don't worry about it, but here's the information anyway. And the bottom line is, people who have relationships with the law can't be trusted. They're not trustworthy. No matter where they are in the system, they're not trustworthy. Nobody associated with the courts is positioned as having any sort of integrity at all. It's a lot like Kay. Page 139. So Kay's still at the bank, and he says, "How good the vice president was at appropriating everything Kay was forced to relinquish. But wasn't Kay relinquishing more than was really necessary? While he was running off to an unknown painter with vague and quite slender hopes, his reputation was suffering irreparable damage. I'm no match for him at the moment," Kay said to himself, "but once I've dispensed with my personal difficulties, he's going to get it and get it good." Kay's worried about his reputation, which is something that both applies to his job and to the law. Both are being weakened by the trial, and it's another sense in which the law becomes disempowering in all areas. At the same time, though, that he's being disempowered in the present, he's still able to hypothesize some sort of distant future where he has everything together, right? All the ducks are in a row, and then he will apply and execute justice against the vice president in a harsh and ruthless way. He's going to get it, and he's going to get it good. Right? I mean, do you see where that sounds a lot like the court? It's gonna be eventual, it will be relentless, it might be slow, it might take a while, but once it's there, it'll be powerful. It's the same logic. Or at least so, maybe not exactly the same. Pretty close though? Okay. Page 145. He's talking with Chitarelli the painter, and he's looking at one of the canvases, and he asks what it is. It's the figure of Justice, the painter finally said. Now I recognize it, said Kay. There's blindfolds over her eyes, and here are the scales. But aren't those wings on her heels, and isn't she in motion? Yes, it's actually Justice and the goddess of victory in one. That's a poor combination, said Kay, smiling. Justice must remain at rest, otherwise the scales sway and no just judgment is possible. Right? And here he distinguishes between judgments and just judgments. For there to be a just judgment, one must be at rest. If you're in motion, as victory does, is moving, you can't have a just judgment. All you have are judgments. Does that make sense? Titorelli continues coloring until, quote, the play of shadow surrounded the head like an ornament or a sign of high distinction. But except for an imperceptible shading, brightness still surrounded the figure of Justice, and in this brightness the figure seemed to stand out strikingly. Now it scarcely recalled the goddess of justice, or even that of victory. Now it just looked like the goddess of the hunt. The painter's work attracted Kay more than he wished. At last, however, he reproached himself for having been there for so long without having really undertaken anything for his own case. Justice is revealed as victorious in the form of a hunter. It's active, searching, finding, pursuing, achieving, in spite of the fact that its pursuit renders invalid its ability to measure accurately, and Kay feels its attraction. He's pulled toward that model. He is its prey, but he's also it at the same time. And if you're wondering what that vision of justice looks like, that combination of justice and victory that risks making an unjust judgment, I guess what comes to mind for me is the first Gulf War, right? Where there's a need to have both victory and justice instantly. And the fact that Saddam didn't actually have the weapons that he was accused didn't matter, right? You can go to war, you can go out for victory, you can go on the hunt, you can accuse, and you can call yourself as one pursuing justice, but the way to pursue justice is not to be the goddess of the hunt. That's not what justice looks like, at least not adjusted justice. Does that make sense? Yeah.
A few years ago, I started to read a biography of Kafka, and it was really something else. And the writer portrayed him as being the ideal bureaucrat, really a good guy who tried to help people out and tried to be just and so forth and so on. So how would the reality of Kafka himself, being a very fair person and a good guy, connect up with this somewhat corrupt victim who's now being accused and is himself, though not really of much merit or consciousness or ability? Do you think Kafka had seen this kind of person frequently in the bureaucracy of justice, and so really he's portraying a character here and not so much himself, or how does it fit together in your view?
I haven't read that biography, and I haven't read any biography. I mean, I've read bits and pieces and studied things here and there, but nothing not a sustained study. From what I've read, though, he had a sort of despairing and melancholy disposition. And if that's true, and if that's the case, his self-judgment is probably going to be at odds from the judgments that other people would have. So what he sees himself as doing or is able to do is always more harsh and unfair and more relentless and more painstaking than anything anybody would apply to him. So what he doesn't see himself as being able to do good in the system. He sees himself participating in all the failures of the system and lacking the wherewithal to actually know how to change things to truly help. Maybe he can help in this case, but not enough. Maybe he can do something in this case, but not enough. And what he's doing all the time is keeping that system of power in play. That'd be a guess. You know, and it might be, I'm sure, other people that he saw going through different systems and whatnot, but it seems like it's written from the perspective of somebody who understands what an unbearable and unrelenting sense of accusation looks like, even if it's self-imposed. And if it's not self-imposed, if it's externally imposed, it's really hard to tell what that looks like sometimes. You know, especially if you take a Freudian model of the superego that just constantly bears down in judgment against the poor, fragile ego or the self. Does that make sense?
Makes sense, yeah.
All right. Page 149, K on justice. K says, a number of subtle points are involved in which the court loses its way, but in the end it pulls out some profound guilt from somewhere where there is originally none at all. And this is his question, but you are innocent, he's asked. Well, yes, said K, that's the main thing. K above is unable to recognize justice, and is habitually a poor judge of character. Right? K is a terrible judge of character. He's not necessarily fit to adjudicate his own case. Right? And by this point in the novel, you don't believe K's judgments. He can't know whether he's innocent because he doesn't know what it would mean to be guilty. Right? 150, the universality of the system. The painter says everything belongs to the court. And the everything is really everything. It's not only the painter, the girls, and the offices, it's also K himself. Everyone and everything is the court. The world is the court. Society is the court. Everything is. There's always an office that belongs to the court. There's always an agent of the court somewhere. They're in the supply rooms in your office. Right? They're in your bedroom. They're in the bedroom next to you. They're in the window across the street. The court is everywhere. There's nothing in the world that is not part of the court, even if they don't know it at the time. Page 154. Judgments. Here are the kinds of judgments that are able to be made. And this, again, is just a brilliant and I think fair representation of how things work in some ways. The first judgment is actual acquittal. He says, it's said to have occurred, but it's difficult to determine. Legends, you can believe them, but they can't be proved true. Nonetheless, they shouldn't be entirely ignored. Right? So there are legends of an actual acquittal coming through. He hasn't heard of any, actually. They can't be proven, but you can't dismiss them. So there might be an actual acquittal, but don't count on it. But don't discount it either. Just leave it there. 2, apparent acquittal. This takes concentrated but temporary effort. It relies on judges who have the power to release from charges, but not free you from them. Further arrests are always possible, right? So you can get an apparent acquittal and be released from charges and then arrested as soon as you show up at your house again. Right? Your acquittal is only apparent. Number 3, protraction. It's a more modest but continuous kind of effort where the trial is constantly kept at the lowest stage. There's not the danger of a sudden arrest, but the defendant is never free. Right? In an apparent acquittal, you're free, although you can always be arrested again. In a protraction, you're never free, but you don't have the danger of a sudden arrest. The trial, as it's explained, must be kept constantly spinning within the tight circle to which it's artificially constricted. Right? So as long as you keep the bureaucracy wrapped around over here, you're never free, but you'll never be arrested. In other words, both 2 and 3 prevent conviction, but they also prevent actual acquittal. You'll never be charged as guilty, but you'll never be held as innocent.
That kind of reminds me of this trial of Amanda Knox in Italy.
Yeah.
You know, that she went through trial and she finally was declared not guilty. And she comes to the United States and then they want to try her again. You know?
Yeah.
So
It was an apparent acquittal.
You know,
Yeah.
here in the States, at least, once you go through a trial like that, then they don't have an opportunity to retry it.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're talking about is kind of, you're always on trial.
Well, it's the fact that the apparent acquittal, you're released from charges, but you're not called innocent. You're not free from the charges. You're just released from them. Mm-hmm. And there's a really fine distinction that Kafka is making, but I think it makes sense, doesn't it? Like the charges are always there, they're just not acting on you at this moment, or this one, or this one, but at any point they could be dropped on you again. But until they're dropped on you again, you're released, but you're not freed from them.
But he was never in jail anyway.
No, because he never did anything truly wrong. I mean, why would he go to jail?
Not in a physical jail.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
It's
true
almost
too.
more effective in a form of arrest because he's just immobilized.
Yeah, and it just weakens him. So the implications are as follows. Innocence here is a myth or a legend, and the weight of suspicion and the pressure of judgment is omnipresent. One can suspend or delay an actual conviction where one's guilt is made total, but it becomes almost impossible to leave the burden of guilt behind once one has entered into the world of the court. Kay grasps the truth of this. That which prevents conviction also prevents acquittal. Right? If you're going to play the game, you'll never be innocent, but it'll keep you from being guilty. Right? You'll just be held in suspension and just delay things for a while. One can never become freed from the courts. One can only limit its likely intrusiveness. It's always there.
And we'll find later it's extrapolated even into the cathedral and religion.
Yep.
The court's in there also.
Yep. The
No
courts are
place-
everywhere.
No place to hide.
The courts are everywhere. They own everything. Yeah. Yeah.
It reminds me of my own case. You get convicted of a federal charge, okay, you serve your federal sentence, but on your record are several state charges. Now those charges are never pursued, so you assume they're dropped, but they always stay on your record. So 40, 50 years ago, there are still those state charges that you were once charged with, but they never conclusively carried out a trial on you, see. And so in that way, you stay within the realm of the court, and yet you finished your federal time, and yet that hangs over you till the end of your life, even maybe past that.
I think that'd be a
Well,
violation of due process. Sorry.
They don't care about that.
I'm reminded of the TSA and the argument where people say, wait a minute, we have a right to privacy. You shouldn't be looking at my phone logs. And other people will say, well, gee, if you haven't done anything wrong, why should you care?
Yeah, and
It's
it's
very, it's like, wait a minute, that doesn't feel right to me, but that's how some people
well, it's the presupposition of the possibility of your guilt that people
Yeah.
react to.
Yeah.
And once that presupposition is there, most people accuse themselves. I mean, it's like, what do I have on there? Like, what could be held against me that I didn't, and it's just.
Well, what would happen if I had a friend who 10 years from now becomes a member of ISIS, for example? I would be guilty?
Yeah,
Maybe.
they'd know.
It's really, that's an interesting point. Back in I talked about this once, I lived in Jerusalem. There was this military coup against the left-wing government. And one of the first times that the people appeared on, the new authorities appeared on TV, and they were being accused of persecuting ideas. And they said, we don't persecute ideas, only those who have them.
All right. Well, here are the overall conclusions for this week. Structurally, it seems as though Kafka does much to show Kay as a mirror of the court system. Much that is true of the courts, including much that he dislikes about them, is also true of himself. They tend to be hidden, disguised, superficial, and shallow. Both participate in systems and structures of power that require underlings and schemes. Both engage in shallow intrigues, Kay with the vice president and with the courts themselves. The major difference is that the law hunts without fatigue, and Kay becomes increasingly worn down by the effects of power. He rarely understands himself as wielding power, he excuses his own tendency to judge others, and seems to suspect deep down that he's fighting a losing battle. Simply put, Kafka shows how choosing to fight or choosing to surrender are both the wrong choices. There's no way out of the system once you've gotten in. That's it for today.